And we're on once again. Okay. So I'll get over here and we'll be able to see this is kind of where we were. And like I had more or less stopped when I was doing this previously. Thank you. These are all these interesting laws and partial pressures and things like that. But this is the last thing that I pointed out. That's why we tell people, and this is important, to take long, deep breaths slow. Okay. Because you, particularly when they're having trouble breathing or they're excited, because when you respire very, very rapidly, you're really only doing about 40% efficiency as opposed to the deep breath. So if you double the amount of breathing that you're doing, even if you have the time, it compensates for what's called alveolar dead space, because it's just air that isn't useful and we can't avoid it. About 30% of the air we typically breathe at a typical breath is just air that's in there keeping things filled. It's not really exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide. So that's the first little nugget that I think is important. So that's when they talk about external and internal, internals at the cell, externals in the lung, and then this is all of these laws that are really come off of this thing we call the ideal gas law, which just means a constant relationship between pressure and volume. And the only thing that really alters it a little bit is temperature. So as temperature increases, it alters some of the factors. So, for an old chemistry major like me, it's a pretty famous equation. And so what's interesting about gases is they act kind of like in chemistry. We call it partial pressure of gases. That's how we determine concentration. So what you're going to see that we breathe, roughly our atmosphere is about 80% nitrogen and about 20% oxygen. Okay, and there's other trace elements that are in there. That's effectively the air that we breathe. So that kind of gives you an idea. We work off of those numbers and determine how things move. So here they are. The total pressure is the 760. That's roughly one atmosphere. We're more or less at one atmosphere. That changes, as you'll see in the course of this PowerPoint, with regard to that changes a bit. Like if you go up in elevation. So, and it happened to me when because my stepdaughter and her significant other are out in Denver. I mean, that impacts you. All of a sudden, there's a whole lot proportionally less oxygen, and it takes some getting used to. For some people, I was one of them. So a great big headache for a while until I kind of adjusted to that. And then we went from there 6,000 feet, basically mile high, up almost at one point to 11,000 feet. We were going out, it was in summer, going to Snowshoe, which is a ski resort at about 8,000. So it took a little time to get to. It's really nice in the summer, by the way. Okay. So, and there's a little other stuff that's in there. So at high altitudes, they decline, but at lower altitudes, it increases. And that's significant too. So if you know somebody, or perhaps you are a diver, a scuba diver, there's a real problem. And it can happen. It's not just for divers. It happen to people, let's say, who work underwater, in the sense that they might be in some setup where they've gone down in some type of submersible vessel, which they have a lot of today. Like they're talking about they're always talking about looking at the Titanic. They're talking about a ship, an old galleon that sank off of Colombia that they're trying to raise. All of those are recent types of things. And what happens as you go deep, the pressure increases. When the pressure increases, that 80% of nitrogen gets pushed in to your bloodstream. Okay. And so you have to undergo something when you come up, and this is particularly true for somebody who's a scuba diver, they have a decompression stops. Because if they come up too rapidly, the nitrogen comes out rapidly and it comes out as bubbles. And those bubbles are bubbles of gas that block circulation, and they get a terrible, potentially fatal condition called the bends. And the bends come because they're doubled over in pain because blood is not getting to vital structures. That's what it comes. So you have to make decompression stops, and they have to look at. There's a whole. They'll have like an onboard computer on their wrist to be able to tell. It's very sophisticated today with those types of things. That's not for me. But people who dive or were certified in diving. My ex was certified diver. Though she did, from the time we got married, she had stopped doing it by that time. So that's interesting stuff, and that's when you hear about that. So decompression chambers, and we use they're called hyperbaric because they put you in a chamber with high pressure, pushes the gas back in the bloodstream and slowly releases it. So you might be in there for a considerably large amount of time. There's a lot of interesting thing with hyperbaric treatments. And this is showing you the relationships that you can see at atmosphere, even as they get all the way to the alveoli, the partial pressures they exert. And this is kind of how oxygen and carbon dioxide move around, particularly when you look at these numbers. And they'll show it to you. So when it contacts with liquids, it goes into the liquid. That's the nitrogen thing, etc. That will push it into the bloodstream. So solubility, and this is a big factor when it comes to respiration. There's a big difference between oxygen in your bloodstream and oxygen in your lungs. That concentration gradient drives the bus. It drives diffusion. It's relatively small for carbon dioxide, yet they move equally. And the interesting thing is because carbon dioxide is a lot more soluble. So you don't need a big difference for it to move. You need a little difference, but it moves rapidly because effectively it gets through those membranes much more efficiently. That's what's meant by solubility. So CO2 is 20 times more soluble in water than oxygen. Okay. And the nitrogen notwithstanding, it's not really part of the process. And so that's where the hyperbaric chambers can come in, and we do use it. So you can develop oxygen toxicity if it's excessive, because again, one of the problems with oxygen is the generation of free radicals. Anybody, and I think we've covered a little bit of this already, anybody who breathes oxygen on a regular basis like we do has to have methods to avoid these toxic derivatives. As you recall, we're talking about how T cells, and basically they poked holes in cells and shot enzymes in them that would blow the cell up. And a lot of it was using toxic derivatives of oxygen. Basically, you're inducing the cell to die by a variety of methods in our immune system. So we have that. But when we're exposed to high levels of that, it can be problematic. And maybe you have to take extra steps. It doesn't mean we don't use hyperbaric oxygen. I've seen that used for people with incipient gangrene when they're not getting enough oxygen into their limbs. Okay. So using that, people with carbon monoxide poisoning, very often they go in oxygen chambers. Typically a burn unit will have those. And there's a really good movie from years ago called Backdraft, where they demonstrated that. That was the guy who died who was like in Dirty Dancing. It's coming to me. You're not helping. Using Ghost. It'll come to me. But a very an actor everybody liked. And what happened was that they were doing this movie. It's a very interesting movie. Backdraft about what happened with firefighters, and there was an explosion, and they show them in hyperbaric chambers. You can find it; it's there. I'm sure you can watch it for free on YouTube with commercials. And so there's a lot of problems that are associated with it. Okay, and there's a lot of different things. So you can see the alveoli, more carbon dioxide and water vapor than the atmosphere. Has to do with exchanges. We moisturize the air, so we humidify it. There's mixture of gases with what's partially mixing with what's going out. So there's some variations that are there. But these are the big factors: the pressure gradients and the gas solubilities. And then you get into the stuff that can impact it. Surface area, which is really important, all those alveoli, that giant puzzle ball of surface area, so to speak. And then whether there's thickness. That somebody with, if you've just got over the flu, you're going to have a number of areas where it's unusually thick. And that's why people have difficulty breathing. And so if any of you are going to go into patient care, you're going to be familiar with this. Now, not that you have to know chapter and verse and so you go up to, well, your surface area of your respiratory membrane is impaired, but understand that that's maybe why they're having that difficulty. That's associated. So it's not unanticipated. And then this very interesting thing called ventilation perfusion coupling. And that's we see it in the body constantly. I'll talk about it in the kidney. I'll talk about it in the digestive tract. I'll talk about it everywhere. And what it means is that our lungs have a neat mechanism. If you've had, good news, if you had the flu and some of your lungs are still damaged and just get repairing, or there's still stuff in there that's eventually going to go away, it directs the blood flow to areas which aren't affected. Good. We can reoxygenate the blood easy. And it will do this. It shunts it so it matches ventilation where the air is to perfusion, which is where the blood supply is. Well, that's great. And it does that even if you're getting really sick, even if you have emphysema. But all of a sudden, that mechanism will reach an abrupt end, roughly when about 80% of your lung is gone. And that's when I say it all the time when someone who just had, that was very quick. Okay. Are you doing yours today?
I did.
Okay. So after, does that work for you? Do you have time?
I have class at.
Do you want to do this now?
I can.
Okay. Come on, grab one. Here. Thank you. And so moving on. So and you can just go someplace where I'm not making all sorts of noise and go outside and be fine. We'll keep an eye on everything. Moving on. So the big deal is that person will then go to see their doctor, or they'll see a pulmonologist, a respiratory specialist, and they'll go, hey, you got to be on oxygen for the rest of your life. And the reason is because all of a sudden all those compensatory mechanisms have failed, and the body is replete with those things. So it's a lot of good news and bad news. And you see it all the time. To me, it's remarkable how when someone starts to fail, it's very easy. Then the other systems start to shut down. There's so much interrelationship that's there. And lungs and heart are extraordinarily interrelated. So this is the partial pressure. So alveolar oxygen and venous blood. So, and it's not, that number is incorrect on the PowerPoint that's here. Okay. Venous blood and the alveoli, you're going to see the air coming in is a little bit different. I'll get you the right numbers. So it only takes in about a quarter of a second, a red blood cell, seconds to travel from the start to the end of a pulmonary capillary. So you've got 3 times. That's the important part. The numbers here are a little fudged. And I think that's just an error in the PowerPoint. But what goes on is it means, because that's not a big gradient, obviously. That's a non-gradient. But what happens is that in a quarter of a second, your blood reoxygenates, so you have 3 times that. So if there's an area where there's a defect, we're good to go. Okay. It's less steep when it comes to carbon dioxide. So the blood number is probably closer to 100, 70 to 100. And I think that, and again, I'll have to look at the text and correct that misprint. But here, the CO2, this has a very small gradient. So it's not as steep, okay, if that other PowerPoint was correct, but it's 20 times more soluble. So it moves more efficiently than oxygen. So that plays a role too. Some things can get through things differently. And they're just showing it to you. And it's hard for me to tell, oh yeah, here, that 104 to 40. See? That's really, you don't see it because it's on the next slide. Sorry. I see 2 slides when I use my computer here. The 102 to the 40. So at the start of the capillary, the oxygen is down at 40. And by the end, in that quarter of a second, it's up to 104. So it's a very, very quick transition. And even though it's got the end of the capillary, you've got adequate time for that to occur. So I can't get a lot out of this. And I wish it was a better illustration that's there, but this is a little bit. Oxygen in the air is 160, CO2 is 0.3. In the lungs, we get to 104 and 40. And then on the other side, on the side where it's exchanges, the oxygen in the capillaries, or in the venules as they come in, the pulmonary artery, it's coming in 40, so you get 40 to 104, and then the other one you get to 45 to 40. So it's really why, even though there's differences in the concentration, it moves relatively efficiently, as you can see. Thickness. They're very thin. It's two lining cells sharing a common basement membrane. So it's just like they've got two cells and a piece of paper between them. That's ultra thin. So it just gets right through. Okay, a lot of surface area is quite large, 40 times the surface area of the skin. So imagine how much skin we all have, and then 40 times more in your lungs if you added up all the surface area. Plenty of, like I said, we have an abundance of things. Lungs are like that. You'll see the kidneys are like it. I mean, you've got 30 feet of intestines for digesting and absorbing. So we got a lot of stuff in there that if it goes bad, we can work around. I'm doing my digestive thing for my anatomy, my advanced anatomy group. That's our next topic. I mean, you have a colon is probably 8 to 10 feet long. You don't even need spare parts. So if the lungs are waterlogged, in other words, if they're fluid, the heart's not being very efficient. That's what happens with left heart failure. It's a plumbing problem. Ultimately, the fluid in the lungs doesn't get pumped out by the heart, so it backs up. Just like you got a clog in a drain and up it goes. Okay. In that case, because of that, then you don't have enough time to reoxygenate, and then the body's not giving enough oxygen. Well, the heart senses that. Oh, we don't have enough oxygen. I'm going to work harder. Well, the heart works harder, but it's not even getting enough oxygen to work harder. It's a vicious cycle. Fluid keeps accumulating. The heart works overtime. Finally, something gives. And if it's the heart that gives, and somebody dies of cardiac failure from that. So different diseases, emphysema, and you'll see a very good slide coming up next, literally means trapped air, which I've told you before. It doesn't necessarily imply, though typically we associate it with the lung. So what happens is the damage in the lung causes the walls of this chamber with all that surface area to begin to break down. So rather than having tons of little nooks and crannies for exchange, now it's got big chambers filled with air, and the air can't get out as efficiently. So the air becomes effectively trapped. And then other stuff, tumors, mucus, inflammatory material. So take a look. A normal lung, tons and tons of surface area. An emphysematous lung, same magnification, by the way. And you can see those massive chambers, hence the name emphysema for trapped air. And thankfully now, we see a lot less people who smoke. Okay. And we're not going to go into my horrible habits for such a long period of time. But if you're watching, and even new movies today where they depict old movies, everybody smokes. They all did. Okay. If you go back and watch movies from the 40s, they're all smoking. It was just everywhere. The Surgeon General's report didn't come out until 1964, and there's a whole lot of the history of the tobacco industry, not telling people about how addictive nicotine was, and B, how harmful smoking was. And that wasn't never a terribly well received movie with Russell Crowe and Al Pacino called The Insider, which very, very, because it's accurate about this guy was a tobacco company insider who blew the whistle and did a 60 Minutes piece that never aired, but basically the proverbial cat was out of the bag. Very interesting movie, by the way. So moving on. So this is the idea of the coupling. Perfusion, blood going to a tissue, doesn't matter what tissue. Ventilation, gas, in this case, getting to the alveoli. So they match for optimal activity, for the best degree of exchange. And there are local mechanisms. So the amount of oxygen controls the arteriolar diameter. So it controls what blood vessels are going where. And the PCO2, the amount of carbon dioxide, controls the bronchiole, the air passageways. So basically, it widens passageways where the blood supply is greatest to optimize, to make the best possible exchange to protect the person. And that's great until, like I said, everything goes wrong. And I think that's a very interesting factor. So when the air, and this is the interesting part, it's somewhat counterintuitive. So normally when there's a lot of air, you wouldn't expect the arterioles to dilate. Oh, we got plenty of air. We'll just constrict. We'll move the air someplace else. Not in the lung. Got a lot of air. We'll just make it wider. Okay. Where it's low, we'll make it constrict. Okay. Oh, we don't have enough air, so we'll make it even smaller, so no air. Think of it this way: why waste the air? Let's direct it to some place. So it directs the blood to go to the alveoli where the oxygen is high, so the blood can reoxygenate. Okay. And it's the opposite of what we see in the tissues. They dilate. Most of every place else, oh, we're not getting enough oxygen down to your toes. We're going to try to have mechanisms to create an increased amount of blood flow so the toes don't die or become gangrenous, which is a very significant problem, particularly in diabetics. CO2, same thing. Okay, when the alveolar CO2 is high, we dilate the bronchioles. The same idea. You have enough in there. Why make them wider? Because we're going to have the exchange. And so it's the same idea. And so it effectively balances to accomplish this ventilation perfusion aspect of it. Okay. And yeah, there's different things that have to do with gravity and different things that may have to do if there's, you're getting over a cold or a flu, that kind of thing. So that, and they're just demonstrating this to you with this series of illustrations. At the tissue level, there's certain similarities to this. The oxygen at the tissues in your cells is always lower than the arterial blood, okay? So the oxygen is going to go, again, roughly 100 to 40. The PCO2, because the tissues have used up the oxygen, 45 to 40. So it moves out of the tissues where it's been, where it's effectively a waste product into the bloodstream, okay? And so we see this. So the venous blood returning to the heart has oxygen now only down to 40 because effectively it's given it up, and CO2 that has increased to 45 because it's picked up that particular waste product. And again, they show you the same type of thing here. And that's everything for that particular sequence. And then the last one talks a little bit about diseases, and that's the next one to concentrate on. This is the last one, this 21C. And it should talk a little bit about the utilization curve for hemoglobin and the transportation thereof. So we're going to take a look at that. And this is a big difference between, and I commented on it a little bit in blood. If you remember when we talked about the blood, I made a big deal, and this is the second time, and it'll be more than one, when we talk about what happens to the carbon dioxide. For years, the impression that everybody got was, well, the oxygen's riding on the hemoglobin. When it gets to a cell that needs it, it's like hopping off the bus, and now there's an empty seat, and the carbon dioxide takes the seat. No. 70% of the carbon dioxide dissolves in the bloodstream, and you get, I'll write it for the 63rd time of 1,000 that you're going to see. The water in the bloodstream plus the CO2 that dissolves becomes carbonic acid. Okay. And what's interesting about carbonic acid, oh my God, it's an acid, it's in my bloodstream, is it's a weak acid. And so basically it holds on to its hydrogen. The acids give up protons. That's their job. This one doesn't want it. I want my proton. I just thought of something that you would never have a context for. Okay. And so, but what it does is it basically holds on to its proton because it's a comparatively weak acid. And what weak acids make are great buffers. Say a mild neighborhood, they're a buffer. And it splits up into what's called bicarbonate ion, bicarb for abbreviation, and your old friend, a proton, good old H plus. And so by and large, now you have something. So if we added protons, like with acidity, okay, something in your stomach got highly acidic, that'll suck up the extra protons. Or if you had something that was very alkaline, the protons would be there to basically neutralize it, because weak acids will either give up a proton or not. That's what makes them a weak acid. They're fence sitters. You want a proton, take it. Make me an offer. Did you ever buy anything on eBay? You didn't ever buy anything on eBay? You're an Amazon Prime girl, I can tell. We've got a vintage butter dish in the box, never opened. People are offering us stuff on eBay for it. Just saying. We sell, my wife sells a lot of stuff on Amazon too. She's outsourcing now. She's invading thrift stores as we speak. Moving on. So the oxygen basically rides on the hemoglobin. Very little else in the plasma. Okay. So they have a very strong association. And the mistaken idea is that magically, when the oxygen goes to a place where it's needed, all of the oxygen leaves the blood. Nothing could be further from the truth. Only about a quarter of the oxygen leaves. Interestingly enough, it's why if that was the case and all the oxygen jumped off, when someone had a heart attack and the heart stopped working, they would die instantaneously. So 3 of the 4 oxygens are still present, even if it's given up a fair amount of its oxygen, because it only gives it 25%. That's why we have X amount of time to get the heart started again. Think of it that way. So we know about hemoglobin. It's got 4 polypeptide chains. The heme group, the oxygen rides on the heme group. We call it oxyhemoglobin. And basically that's what it is. So as long as it's got that, when it releases it, now it loses it, we call it deoxy. It's nothing major. So the loading and unloading are about the shape. So the molecular shape of hemoglobin is pivotal. Because what happens, and this is the complex part, once it starts to unload oxygen, it gets easier to unload it. That's when you're going to see this S curve. And you're going to see it's not a linear curve here, high to low. Oxygen stays nice and high. And all of a sudden, it's like falling off a cliff. So when somebody starts to have problems and their oxygen starts to go down, when they have a lot of breathing problems, and all of a sudden they crave it, they can go bad really fast. So when they make rounds in a hospital in the morning and check patients and check pulse oxes, when someone has one that starts to dip, you got to tell somebody. Because all of a sudden, we got a 5-alarm fire in our hands very, very quickly. A lot of things go south fast. Okay. As oxygen binds, hemoglobin changes its shape, increasing its tendency to bind. Hey, I got an oxygen. This is fun. I'll take more. And the same thing happens when it loses an oxygen. I lost it. I enjoyed that. All you guys can leave. So you have differences between degrees of saturation. Fully 4 oxygens, anything less, partially saturated. What impacts it? So this loading, or is it something I said? I got you. I give you a hard time. I live to do that. It's okay. I'm the old guy. I should be the one running to the bathroom. So I tell my wife, no input, no output. There's a guy, any golf fans? He just died. He was the starter for the European tour. And famously, they'd have 150 golfers, and he would announce every one without ever leaving over like an 8-hour span. Named Ivor Robson. Very, very, very fun character. So rate of loading or unloading is regulated by different factors. How much oxygen? As you might guess, temperature and pH always play a role. If it's a protein, the default answer, and this is good for standardized tests, things that alter proteins. And if you're going to take a licensure exam, they'll probably ask you that. The big players for proteins are temperature and pH. where our bodies are designed to operate at 37 degrees Celsius and a pH of around 7.4 plus or minus 0.05, 7.35 to 7.45. You should remember those numbers. That's as long as you're in that realm, plus or minus a certain amount over 37 degrees Celsius and plus or minus 7.4, you're good to go. So oxygen influences it, CO2 influences, and then there's this thing, biphosphoglycerate, we always call it BPG. And what happens when oxygen starts to unload, interestingly, the blood begins to have more of this BPG available, and it makes it easier to unload. So it kind of helps to change the shape of red cells and the hemoglobin. So oxygen, biggest influence. So you're going to see the plot, and this is the very famous dissociation curve. Despite my bad artwork, that's the problem. So most of the time, your pulse ox is going to be 80, let's say 92, up here. Close to 100, maybe 94, 95. It gets below 90, roughly here, and then look what happens. It's going. Because once oxygen starts to disassociate, the more it disassociates, the easier it is to leave. So that's a big player, and you have to take that, and it's all about the shapes of the hemoglobin, the individual hemoglobin and the heme units altering to facilitate that. So that's why it's such an interesting and unique molecule. And the molecule is different. In muscles, you have myoglobin. That's different. It releases the oxygen a bit faster by design. Fetal hemoglobin is different still. So there's a lot of differences. Hemoglobin is very much of a unique molecule in that regard. So typically 98 is the number you would like, is optimal number. Yeah, you can breathe deeply. Venous blood, PO2 is 40 and contains 15% of the volume of oxygen. But it's still, even way down there, where if you go back to the curve, you still have 75% saturated. That's, and the famous name for that is the venous reserve, the oxygen remaining in the veins that in an emergency you could still use. Again, surviving when the heart even transiently stops. So, I mean, that's why you have that nugget of time, depending on the temperature, to resuscitate somebody. So, it's the old thing is, well, you can go three weeks without food and 3 days without water and 3 minutes without air. Well, it's probably between 3 and 6 minutes and longer. Because you always hear about people being resuscitated when they fall through the ice. And then somebody observes it and they get rescue people and they bring them out 40 minutes later. And there's any amount of anecdotal evidence to support this. They're able to resuscitate them because the cold limits what's called thermal decomposition. It basically preserves those structures. So when you get oxygen into them, again, it's like keeping them in the freezer. You guys are good like this. We talk about this in micro. When you're like me, when you put something in the freezer, you label it and you date it. You don't go in there and see that plastic bag. Go, what was this? Could have been ground meat, maybe not. You take it out and it's got kind of a funny looking color. Defrost it, maybe the odor is a little. Whoa, are you eating that? I don't think so. Well, fortunately, our bodies are pretty good about that. I got to save the micro stories for micro. And if you have me for that, you have an obligation with the people who have not had me before. Do not give it away. Don't. Oh, we heard that one last year. Don't say that. That's embarrassing. So you begin, and you can see a little here. They're giving you difference, and you can see there's some subtle differences depending on activity. You're going to see some. So these are other factors that play a role. that are not critical for us at this point in time. Increases in temperature, the amount of oxygen. So if you're physically active, okay, if you're working out, changes considerably. They modify the structure, and basically all of those things. Increasing amount of utilization builds up acidity because you're breaking down stuff. Okay, temperature increases physically, your body temperature, that your production of, you have more CO2 is accumulating, more of this BPG. And what it does is it makes the oxygen easier to come off, so it enhances unloading. The idea, you need more oxygen, so it makes it easier to get it. Again, up to a certain point. And so we see a shift, and you'll see the curve here that shows you what begins to happen. So here, remember that one I'm talking about, somebody effectively being in the water is held onto quite a bit more strongly, things like that. And so there's certain advantages, and there's certain disadvantages. When temperature increases, you see it unloads relatively quickly. This is about normal. See, when you start to heat up, now that's pretty darn hot. So that's 9, that's 107 temp. That, most people aren't going to survive a temp of 107. And so again, you can see some of this is the pH relationship with it. That's there, and you can look at the different curves. So you can either have a high pH or you can have a lower pH. And you can see when acid accumulates and it begins to increase that, you can see that it begins to unload even faster. All of those things. The BPG is produced by red blood cells during what's called glycolysis, an alternative way for energy utilization. So when oxygen levels are low, they rise. The cells, they use more oxygen, and a variety of things happen. Again, acidity increases, PCO2 increases. The fancy name they give this is called the Bohr effect. I'm not going to ask you about those proper names to have you recall them. For licensure exams, you should get a study guide that tells you what names you would need to know down the road. Be watchful of those to see if you need to know the Bohr effect or the Dalton effect or whoever's effect it is, okay? So for my advanced phys students, this is important, okay? Because, for medical school admission testing, MCAT testing, this is something you would have to know. So it basically unloads the oxygen where it's supposed to go, okay? That's the whole idea of what this is. All of these factors make the oxygen easier to unload in areas that need the oxygen up to a certain point, of course. The carbon dioxide part of this picture is a bit different, okay? Carbon dioxide, first of all, if it's going to go on the hemoglobin, okay, it's not on the heme unit, not on the iron protein combination. It's on those globin chains, only about 20%. Some of it will dissolve 7 to 10% in the bloodstream. So it's a gas in your bloodstream. So you're not quite like having a carbonated beverage, but there's a certain amount of carbonation that you have. So don't jump up and down a lot. You could. No help. That wasn't funny. That gets a. Do you get that? You know how you shake a can like a pop soda can, my old neighborhood. I've been in this region for 40 years. I've the whole pop thing. That's right. I'm married to 2 different Yinzers. Bellevue girl and a Stanton Heights girl. Give me a break. So but most of it, and so when we have blood that's got carbon dioxide bound, it's called carbaminohemoglobin, no big deal. The big deal is this, just what I wrote before. 70% makes that buffer. And that is, again, the major buffer. That offsets acidity. It offsets excesses in carbon dioxide. It makes it much easier to keep that constant environment of temperature and pH in your bloodstream, and so too all of your proteins appreciate it. That's the idea. And we'll see this, it's the same, we see it again in the kidney. We see its impacts when we start to look at digestive physiology. The reason it's a way of dealing with the acidity that your stomach makes and how we can exchange it back. There's a whole lot that goes on here. And again, I know it's not stuff that necessarily you need to know in detail, but to give you an idea of how these mechanisms work. Right? And there's a very famous enzyme that basically allows this to, and this is a big deal. Okay, it's called carbonic anhydrase. If you go back to this equation, that's the enzyme that basically allows the carbon dioxide and water to form. They're able to make that, and that's in the bloodstream. For instance, in the cerebrospinal fluid, that enzyme doesn't exist. And what that means down the road is that in your bloodstream, this equation, as you can see with the arrows drawn in both directions, that's why we indicate that for an equation that's reversible. It can go either way. Reversible is a great word, so because you can always go in both directions. In the cerebrospinal fluid, we don't have that luxury. So once this forms, it can't go back to its component parts. So the only way we can adjust the pH is effectively when it accumulates excessive carbon dioxide, is to rapidly breathe it out. And so what you'll come to at the end of this, and it's a really important point that you should know, okay, for me as well, the most important factor that makes you breathe is not lack of oxygen, but an abundance of carbon dioxide. Because that triggers your brain. Your brain is surrounded by cerebrospinal fluid. It reads the tea leaves. It reads the percentage of carbon dioxide in the brain. And basically, when that gets too high, you have to breathe. It's that little kid, I'm going to hold my breath and die if you don't. Go ahead, knock yourself out, kid. Yeah. My kids didn't do that. I told you what they used to do. You're being mean to me. 1-800 for a child. That's my kids. I told you, I got them now. They go near me, elder abuse. See, you can do that. You get to be as old as I. Oh, no, I'm old. You're hurting me. So the carbonic anhydrase reverses it, okay? And down the road, this is kind of what happens. It's called the chloride shift. That plays a big deal in how this kind of works. And we have different places in the lung and in the digestive tract where we sort of flip-flop because chloride has a -1 and bicarbonate has a -1, and they flip-flop places, okay? So it doesn't become too positive or too negative. And they show you that. In the lung, whatever is happening at the tissues to allow that carbonic acid to form and buffer, we are able to get rid of it in the lung and flip it back. And so there's a number of areas where that occurs. And they show it to you. I guess it's not important. And then carbon dioxide, this is the other effect that you don't have to know the proper name of. The Haldane effect. It's sort of like the reverse of the Bohr effect. Okay. So the amount of carbon dioxide is affected by the amount of oxygen. So if there's lower oxygen and lower hemoglobin saturation, the more CO2 can be carried. Okay. And it's almost like reversing it. Okay. So we don't get the hemoglobin as much. Okay. And it's able to pick up more carbon dioxide. So it encourages carbon dioxide to be grabbed onto at the tissues and expelled at the lungs. Okay. And so at tissues, as more carbon dioxide enters the blood, more oxygen disassociates. So the carbon dioxide coming in at the tissue level facilitates oxygen going out. And in the lungs, it's sort of the opposite of it. The ability to expel that carbon dioxide allows the oxygen to be picked up. So that's the Haldane effect. They sort of work. Haldane is about carbon dioxide, oxygen is about Bohr. And then here's the buffering system that I talked about. And so these are the different things that affect it. So again, slow, shallow breathing causes an increase. Okay. And so the classic example of that is somebody's hyperventilating like that. And why that can be problematic is that they don't get rid of enough carbon dioxide. I beg your pardon. So carbon dioxide in the blood. Okay. And so you try to get them to breathe more appropriately. When I misspoke, hyperventilating, they're blowing off so much carbon dioxide, it alters their pH. So you all breathe into a paper bag because you're basically re-inhaling carbon dioxide, and it inevitably works for people who are hyperventilating. Because you're really controlling. It's like if you go to the gym and work out, think of what you do. You marry your breathing to your effort. So if you're on a treadmill or you're on a cross trainer, think what happens is your heart rate's going up, you're increasing your breathing and the frequency of your breathing. And then to do it for a long time, you have to marry the two. How active I can be for how much I can do. And when you stop, most people, even if you have a cool down period, it takes a certain amount of time. I have been in the gym, despite what you're all thinking. I've dropped my daughter off there at 5:30 in the morning so she can do a 2-hour workout. Don't like her. Hypoxia, inadequate oxygen. And so if you're not getting enough oxygen, you get this bluish color called cyanosis. Okay. Lots of things can make that. If you're going to go into healthcare, if you're going to just interact with people, how easy is it for you to see when you look at somebody and say, they don't look good. They look pale, they look flushed, they look, something wrong. This is somebody you see every day. We all can tell. And particularly like a loved one, you can tell fairly easily. Okay. If you have some kind of anemia, okay, for some reason you don't have enough hemoglobin, bleeding inside, some kind of iron deficiency, some kind of anemia, that will do it. You just won't get enough oxygen to the tissues. I told you. I was working and treating people and teaching as well as practicing with a hemoglobin around 5. I couldn't walk up those steps continuously. 3 steps I'd stop. No joke. That's it. Okay. So it's extraordinarily demanding. Ischemic. Ischemia, perfusion means adequate circulation. Ischemia means inadequate circulation for an organ to survive or to do well. So the blockage would be that way. Histotoxic. Well, histo means tissue, toxic means poison. So if you've been exposed to some kind of poison, environmental poison, or talk about cyanide or other poisons, conceivably could do that. And I would even do moreover, and certain kinds of bacterial infections produce toxins that can do this as well. Hypoxemic, okay? Typically, you're not getting enough oxygen in your system. That's lung disease. I mean, you could have air that doesn't have enough oxygen, but hypoxemic, really the implication is there's not enough, the lungs aren't working. And very famously, carbon monoxide poisoning. That was that little anecdote about Backdraft, the movie. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are very similar. So this is what the molecules look like. Oxygen is 2 double bonds. I don't know if you remember little dot diagrams, or maybe I do these when I do AP1. Carbon dioxide has 4 bonds. So it's got a double bond here and a double bond here. So it's like, look, this oxygen, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide looks like this. Interestingly, carbon monoxide has a greater affinity for hemoglobin than carbon dioxide. So the carbon with one oxygen, monoxide means one oxygen. When it gets on a hemoglobin, it doesn't let go. And so what it does is it doesn't let go. It effectively destroys that hemoglobin from everything it's on. That's why carbon monoxide poisoning is so tragic. The gas is colorless and odorless, and people have been using it to commit suicide for a long time, either by intent or accidentally, because it's painless, quote unquote. It's like somebody who starts their car in the garage, doesn't open the door, and figures everything's going wrong with it. And look, I understand. Not anybody should be commenting on someone with suicidal ideations. And I don't know enough about it to talk about it. But the big problem with that is once you lose consciousness, unless somebody can find a way to stop it, it's a big problem. And what happens is it alters the hemoglobin permanently. And to tell if someone's in an emergency test, how they know if it's carbon monoxide, they go into a house and they open it up and they go, something's not right in here. Everything's closed up, and they see the person lying down. If their skin has turned pink, interestingly enough, because it has altered the hemoglobin, and you have this unnatural pink appearance. And by that time, unless you get to them right away, and the only thing you can do is basically that hyperbaric oxygen, if they've survived, you try to optimize it. It's not going to push off the carbon monoxide, but understand that your blood cells recycle. They basically have a 2-month lifespan. So every day that a person survives, you're making new blood cells. So if you can get them to survive for a couple of days, they're going to survive, hopefully without damage. And I think I told you about that. It was a real tragic case up in Squirrel Hill with a family, very, very well-known family in the Jewish community up in Squirrel Hill. We knew them very well. It was an oven that went bad, and they had a real nice townhouse in Oakland by the university. It was tragic. So that's part of the thing. It's a very interesting phenomenon, and they show you. I don't know if the sound plays with this or not with my setup here. I'm not sure it does. Be very honest with you. Let me try. Hold on. Thank you. We'll have sound on. If it doesn't, you could certainly play it yourselves if you wish.
Whether you're racing in a triathlon or doing something less strenuous, you need to breathe in oxygen to help you get energy. And breathe out carbon dioxide, a waste product. When you inhale, your diaphragm and rib muscles contract, increasing the volume of your lungs. When you exhale, these muscles relax, decreasing the volume of the lungs. When the lungs expand, air pressure in the lungs drops, causing air to flow into the lungs. When lung volume decreases, air pressure increases, causing air to flow out of the lungs. Air enters the nose or mouth, moves down the trachea, and goes into the two bronchi. Air moves down smaller and smaller bronchioles until it reaches a tiny sac, an alveolus. Each alveolus is surrounded by capillaries. Oxygen diffuses from the alveolus to the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood to the alveolus. As blood flows through the capillary, it becomes rich in oxygen. In the blood, oxygen diffuses into a red blood cell and binds to hemoglobin, a protein made up of 4 subunits. One oxygen molecule can bind to each subunit. Oxygen-rich blood flows from the lungs to the heart. Which pumps this blood to capillaries all over the body. Here, we see oxygen diffusing from a capillary's red blood cells into a muscle cell. Oxygen is used by the cell's mitochondria to produce ATP during cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide is released. How does carbon dioxide leave the body? Carbon dioxide diffuses from cells into capillaries. Some carbon dioxide stays in the plasma, the liquid part of the blood. Most carbon dioxide, however, enters red blood cells. Some carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin. The rest is converted to bicarbonate, which diffuses into the plasma. This oxygen-poor blood flows back to the heart, which pumps it to the lungs. There, carbon dioxide diffuses from the plasma into the alveolus. Bicarbonate enters red blood cells and is converted back to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is also released from hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the red blood cells into the plasma and into the alveolus. When you exhale, air flows out of your lungs. And that's how you release carbon dioxide, get oxygen, and keep on running.
Great. Let's hear it. Okay. And obviously we're going to stop here. And once again, I just want to apologize for not being available for those couple of days. It's just too many other things going on. So if you have any questions or problems, I'm sure by Thursday I'll have those lab practicals all done. I'll have the exam because most everybody will have taken it by then, and I'll give it back to you in the lab so you can take a look at it, all that good stuff. So thanks a lot. Appreciate your time. Goodbye. Farewell.